There are nations that seem condemned, not by politics, but by prophecy. Iran is one of them. For more than 2 millennia, writers who never knew each other, living in different centuries, described the fate of a specific territory in the heart of the Middle East with a precision that defies any theory of chance. What they wrote is devastating, and it has not yet fully come to pass. To understand what the biblical texts say about Iran, you first need to step back in time, step very far back, more than 2,600 years before the world knew the Islamic Republic of Iran, before the Ayatollah, before the nuclear program, before the ballistic missiles and kamikaze drones. This piece of land already had a name engraved in the scriptures. 2 names, in fact, Elam and Persia. And what the prophets wrote about these 2 territories, today united under the Iranian flag, is neither vague nor metaphorical. It is specific, named, and at several points disturbingly relevant today. Elam was one of the oldest civilizations of the Middle East. While Abraham still walked under the skies of Mesopotamia, Elam already had cities, laws, armies, and a reputation that crossed borders. Its capital, Susa, was located approximately 400 kilometers southwest of Babylon, in the heart of what is today the Iranian province of Khuzestan, the southwest of modern Iran, exactly where the Karun River meets the plains that drain into the Persian Gulf. For centuries, Elam was a power that challenged the greatest empires of antiquity. It resisted the Assyrians for decades. It negotiated with the Babylonians. It forged alliances and broke alliances with a diplomatic skill that neighboring peoples respected and feared in equal measure. But what made Elam truly formidable was not its diplomacy. It was the bow. The Elamite archers were considered the best in the ancient Middle East. This is not a vague claim. It is a fact documented in Assyrian, Persian, and in the biblical text itself. Isaiah chapter 22 verse 6 specifically mentions the archers of Elam among the most feared warriors of their era. The bow was the decisive weapon of ancient warfare. Whoever controlled the best archery controlled the battlefield. And Elam controlled the best archers in the known world. This was not a secondary detail. It was the core of its military power, the foundation upon which all its regional influence rested. The bow of Elam was the strength of Elam, plain and simple. And for centuries, no neighboring nation dared to overlook that fact. But empires change. What was invincible yesterday becomes vulnerable tomorrow. And what Jeremiah saw, or received, depending on how you prefer to describe the process, was not the gradual collapse of a power worn down by time. It was something different. It was an intervention described with a specificity that was unsettling. It was precisely at that point that Jeremiah pointed the finger. At the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah, a king of Judah, around the year 697 before Christ, a prophet in Jerusalem received a message and wrote it down. The message is recorded in Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 34 to 39, and it is one of the most specific and technically precise prophecies in the entire Old Testament. Thus says the Lord of hosts, "Behold, I will break the bow of Elam, the foremost of their might." Jeremiah did not say that Elam would be defeated in conventional battle. He did not say that its capital would fall through a normal military siege. He said that its bow, the core of its power, the foundation of all its military capability, would be broken. And then came the list of consequences: dispersion to the 4 winds of heaven, scattering among all nations, terror before enemies, destruction of the king and princes, complete collapse of the established power structure. All of this followed by a clause no one expected: "But it shall come to pass in the latter days that I will bring back the captives of Elam, says the Lord." That ending changes everything. Jeremiah was not merely prophesying destruction, he was prophesying a cycle: judgment, collapse, dispersion, and then, in the latter days, restoration. The pattern that runs through the biblical prophetic texts like a thread that never breaks, fall and rising, demolition and reconstruction, end and new beginning. But before reaching the restoration, the text details the collapse with a clinical coldness that unsettles any attentive reader who knows the geopolitical map of the 21st century. The bow of Elam would be broken, the four winds would turn against them, the sword would pursue them until it consumed them, and the throne of God would be established in Elam, an expression that, in the linguistic patterns of the Old Testament, means absolute sovereignty, total control of a nation's destiny, divine oversight over every decision its leaders make. It is not a human military victory that Jeremiah is describing. It is an intervention of a different order, of an order that risk analysts in Washington and Brussels do not include in their reports, but which the prophets placed at the center of everything they wrote. What does it mean that Jeremiah wrote this prophecy in 697 before Christ, and that Iran's main nuclear facility, the Bushehr reactor, is located exactly in the territory of ancient Elam, in the southwest of the country, a few kilometers from the coast of the Persian Gulf? In the geographic heart of the civilization, the prophet named more than 2,600 years ago. That is the question that biblical researchers and geopolitical analysts have been trying to answer in recent years with growing intensity. And the more the political map of modern Iran overlaps with the map of the ancient Middle East, the more the coincidence begins to seem like an insufficient explanation for what accumulates before one's eyes. But Jeremiah was not alone. While he was writing in Jerusalem, another prophet was writing in Babylon. Ezekiel, deported to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar after the first capture of Jerusalem, received his visions in a different context, in a different cultural setting. Without access to Jeremiah's words about Elam, they were two men in two cities separated by more than 1,000 kilometers, recording words from sources that both attributed to the same origin. And what Ezekiel wrote about the latter days included Persia in a way that none of his contemporaries could have predicted strategically. To understand Ezekiel 38, you need to put into perspective the historical moment in which the text was written. Around the year 590 before Christ, Persia was not yet an empire. It was a region, a people, a second-tier political entity under Median domination. The great empire of the time was Babylon. The Persia that Cyrus the Great would transform into a world power was still decades in the future. Cyrus would conquer Babylon in 539 before Christ, decades after Ezekiel wrote his prophecy. And yet Ezekiel named Persia, not as a footnote, as a central part of a coalition described in the details of a future military operation. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them. Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 5. A line that scholars of the biblical text have been repeating for centuries, and which today, before the geopolitical map of the 21st century, has gained a new and disconcerting dimension. Ezekiel chapter 38 describes a vision that begins with a direct instruction. Set your face toward Gog, of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. The geographic identity of Magog has been debated by scholars for centuries, but the broadest consensus among those who work with historical and archaeological texts points to the territory to the north and northwest of Israel, the region that today corresponds to southern Russia and the areas between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Gog of Magog is not an identifiable historical figure. It is a designation, a title, the leader of a far northern power who will orchestrate a massive coalition against Israel in the latter days. And among the named members of that coalition, Ezekiel lists with precision: Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, Beth Togarmah. Persia is Iran. This is not speculative interpretation. It is a verifiable and documented historical fact. Iran officially changed its name from Persia to Iran only in March of 1935, when the government of Shah Reza Pahlavi formally requested that foreign nations adopt the name that Persians had already been using internally for centuries. In historical terms, it is an extremely recent change. 2,500 years of texts, including the text of Ezekiel, Assyrian records, Greek and Roman annals, consistently use the name Persia for the people and the territory that today form the Islamic Republic of Iran. When Ezekiel writes Persia, he is writing Iran, without possible ambiguity, without the need for additional interpretation. The coalition described by Ezekiel begins to become more legible when you systematically replace the ancient names with modern ones. Magog corresponds to regions north of Israel, identified by many scholars with parts of Russia and the post-Soviet republics of the Caucasus. Cush corresponds to the territory south of Egypt, Ethiopia, and possibly Sudan. Put points to Libya. Goma is frequently identified with regions of Anatolia, in what is today Turkey. Beth Togarmah also in Turkish territory, and possibly parts of Azerbaijan. Persia is Iran. When you map those names onto the modern world, what appears is a list of countries that, at the beginning of the 21st century, already gravitate around a declared or implicit hostility toward Israel and its Western allies. How could a coalition of nations so distinct, with languages, cultures, religions, and histories so different from one another, organize itself around a single geopolitical objective? And how could this alignment already be documented in a text written 2,500 years ago, in a period when several of those nations did not even exist in the form they have today? Ezekiel chapter 38 verse 4 contains one of the most intriguing images in all of biblical prophetic literature. I will put hooks in your jaws and bring you out with all your army. Hooks in the jaws. The image is of a large animal being dragged against its will to a specific place. Biblical commentators have debated the meaning of this expression for centuries, a recurring interpretation, one that gains weight as modern events develop, is that the nations that will form this coalition will not necessarily be acting with full strategic autonomy. There will be forces beyond human political calculation moving this alignment toward a specific confrontation, at a specific moment, against a specific target, as if every sovereign decision of every leader of those nations were being directed by a logic greater than their own, one they do not perceive. Verse 8 of Ezekiel 38 uses an expression that scholars repeatedly point to with emphasis, in the latter years, and verse 16 repeats, in the latter days. Ezekiel is not describing something that happened in his own time. He himself projects the events into the distant future, and the specific scenario he describes, Israel restored in the Promised Land, dwelling in apparent safety without walls between the cities, only became geographically possible from the 14th of May of 1948, when the State of Israel was declared after nearly 2,000 years of dispersion. Before that date, the prophecy of Ezekiel 38 had no available scenario in which to be fulfilled. There was no Israel to be attacked. There was no return to be reversed. After 1948, the scenario became available, and with each passing decade, the elements Ezekiel described became increasingly recognizable on the political map of the real world. Iran occupies a central role in this narrative for reasons that go far beyond prophecy. From a raw geopolitical standpoint, Iran is the only regional power in the Middle East with a declared capability to directly attack Israel. With a ballistic missile program covering the entire territory between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean, and with a state ideology that includes the destruction of Israel as an explicit and public objective. No other country on the current political map combines these three elements in the way Iran does. And when you place this alongside the text of Ezekiel, which names Persia as an active participant in a final invasion against Israel, the parallel does not require significant interpretive effort to be recognized. Iran's missile program is one of the largest arsenals of ballistic rockets in the Middle East. Defense analyst estimates calculate that the country possesses between 3,000 and 4,000 missiles of different ranges, including models capable of hitting any point on Israeli territory from Iranian soil. The distance between Tehran and Tel Aviv is approximately 1,500 kilometers in a straight line, and Iran possesses missiles that cover twice that distance with ever-increasing precision. Beyond the ballistic missiles, Iran's military drone program has become one of the most advanced in the world, at a speed that surprised Western analysts. Long-range drones, small kamikaze drones, drones carrying explosive payloads, technology that Iran has exported to Russia, to Hezbollah in Lebanon, to the Houthis in Yemen, to militias in Iraq and Syria. Each destination of this technological export is a node in a network that extends across almost the entire region surrounding Israel. This brings us to the dimension of Iranian influence that the biblical texts do not describe directly, but which any serious analysis of Iran's role in contemporary conflicts must include: the proxy network. Iran does not fight its enemies only with its own forces. It fights through agents it maintains, trains, and finances in multiple countries simultaneously, what its leaders call the axis of resistance. Hezbollah in Lebanon, universally recognized as the most sophisticated armed arm of this network, with estimates ranging between 150,000 and 200,000 rockets and missiles pointed at Israeli territory, stored in depots distributed across villages and civilian cities in southern Lebanon. Hamas in Gaza, whose attack on October 7th of 2023, which killed more than 1,200 people in a single day, the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, was executed with Iranian training, armament and financing provided over years of systematic preparation. The Houthis in Yemen, who disrupted maritime traffic in the Red Sea and launched drones and missiles against Israeli territory from a distance of more than 2,000 kilometers, crossing the airspace of multiple countries. The Iraqi militias, which attacked American military bases in Iraq and Syria more than 200 times in the months following October 7th. Each of these actors is distinct in its origin, but each operates within a structure that Tehran finances, trains, and in varying degrees strategically directs, except when Iran itself decides to enter. On the 13th of April of 2024, Iran did something it had never done in all its history as an Islamic republic since 1979. It launched a direct attack against Israeli territory from Iranian soil. More than 300 drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles were fired simultaneously toward Israel. It was the first time in history that Iran attacked Israel directly, without intermediaries, without plausible deniability, without the cover of a proxy group. The overwhelming majority of the projectiles were intercepted by Israeli air defense with the assistance of American, British, and Jordanian forces. More than 99% of the projectiles were shot down before causing significant damage. But the precedent was established. The line that had never been crossed was crossed. And what happened afterward accelerated everything at a speed no one in the international community had clearly foreseen. On the 13th of June of 2025, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion. About 200 combat jets, along with explosive drones and Mossad sabotage teams, struck dozens of Iranian nuclear and military installations in a coordinated offensive that took hours to complete. The uranium enrichment complex at Natanz, the heart of the Iranian nuclear program, located in underground facilities 80 meters deep in the province of Isfahan, was struck with surgical precision. The Fordow complex, buried in a granite mountain near the city of Qom at a depth designed to withstand conventional airstrikes, was also targeted in the operation. Nuclear scientists and commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps were killed. Entire generations of accumulated technical knowledge were eliminated in a single day. The declared objective of Israel was direct: to interrupt Iran's uranium weaponization program before it reached the point of no return. The so-called 12-day war lasted until the 24th of June of 2025, when a ceasefire mediated by the United States was reached. Iran responded with approximately 100 drones, a fraction of the attack received. The conflict paused, but it did not end. And it is precisely here that Jeremiah's prophecy about the bow of Elam returns with a force that biblical researchers cannot easily ignore. The Iranian nuclear program, its modern bow, the core of its strategic power, the greatest trump card of intimidation that Tehran possessed before the world, was severely damaged in an operation that lasted days. The facilities at Natanz and Fordow, both in the heart of Iranian territory, were struck. The scientists who conducted the program were eliminated. The Bushehr reactor, located in the southwest of Iran, in the geographic heart of ancient Elam, is under constant observation by satellites and intelligence services of dozens of countries. What Jeremiah called the foremost of their might, the central instrument of the nation's strategic strength, the bow that allowed its enemies to intimidate the entire world, was partially broken. And this happened in exactly the same historical period when other pieces of the prophetic scenario were falling into place at a speed that surprised even the most careful analysts. Iran's nuclear program was enriching uranium to 60% purity before Operation Rising Lion, only 30 percentage points from the 90% threshold required for weapons use. With the number of advanced centrifuges Iran was operating at Natanz, estimated at more than 20,000 units installed in underground tunnels, the time needed to produce enough nuclear material for a weapon had fallen from years to months. The archery of Elam, which 2,600 years ago could strike a warrior at 200 meters with a bronze arrow, had evolved into potentially nuclear warheads capable of reaching Tel Aviv in less than 10 minutes of flight. The geographic connection that biblical researchers most frequently cite when discussing Jeremiah and modern Iran is this. Bushehr, Iran's only operational nuclear reactor, sits on the eastern coast of the Persian Gulf, in the same territorial strip that constituted the heart of the ancient civilization of Elam. Elam's capital was Susa, known today as Shush, in the same Iranian province of Khuzestan. The Bushehr nuclear plant is in Bushehr province, immediately south of Khuzestan, on the edge of the same Elamite territory. The most powerful bow the nation of Elam possessed in the 21st century was being forged on exactly the same piece of land where Jeremiah said the bow would be broken. The history of Elam is inseparable from the history of Persia, and the history of Persia is inseparable from the history of Iran. Elam existed for more than 3,000 years before Cyrus the Great incorporated its territory into the Persian Empire around 539 before Christ. Elam's capital, Susa, became one of the imperial capitals of Persia. It was there that Esther lived in the palace of Ahasuerus, there that Nehemiah served as the king's cupbearer, there that Daniel received part of his visions, as recorded in Daniel chapter 8, verse 2. I was in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam. The city that Jeremiah condemned became one of the centers of Persian power. The territory that would be scattered to the four winds housed the prophets and the exiles of the same people who prophesied its judgment. The history of Elam, of Persia and of Israel is intertwined in ways that no secular geopolitical analysis can fully map. Daniel is the third vertex of this prophetic triangle. Exiled in Babylon, Daniel received visions that described empires that had not yet been born. In Daniel chapter 8, he describes a ram with two horns pushing westward, northward, and southward, and no animal could withstand it or escape its power. The biblical text itself offers the interpretation in verse 20. The ram that you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. Daniel was not describing something from the past. He was describing the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire years before it existed as a dominant power. The ram that pushed in all directions without any force being able to contain it was Persia. And when Daniel wrote this, he was living under Babylonian rule, in an era when Persia was still emerging from the shadows of history. The alliance forming between Russia and Iran in the second and third decades of the 21st century is one of the most cited elements by scholars who analyze the scenario of Ezekiel 38. Iranian drones were used on Ukrainian territory by Russian forces from 2022 onward. War technology provided by Tehran to Moscow in the context of the conflict with Ukraine. In exchange, Russia provided air defense systems and advanced military technology to Iran. A mutual exchange documented by Western governments and confirmed by satellite imagery. Two countries with different ideologies, different languages, completely distinct cultures, but with a converging interest in weakening the Western order led by the United States and in reducing Israel's influence in the region. Magog and Persia in a growing alliance, exactly as the text of Ezekiel describes. Turkey adds a layer of complexity to this scenario under the government of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Turkey, a NATO member and historic Western partner, has progressively been positioning itself in a more hostile manner toward Israel, more sympathetic to Palestinian causes, and more open to dialogue with Iran and Russia. Gomer and Beth Togarmah, the ancient names Ezekiel uses to designate powers of Anatolia, have become increasingly recognizable in the geopolitical behavior of modern Turkey. It is not a certainty. It is a developing pattern, and developing patterns are exactly what the biblical prophets described as the sign that the clock is turning. The prophecy of Ezekiel 38 describes the attack happening at a specific moment, when Israel is dwelling safely, without walls, without bars, and without gates. This detail matters. The current state of Israel, one of the most militarized nations in the world, with defended borders, multi-layered air defense systems, and permanent alert status, does not correspond exactly to the picture of security described by Ezekiel. This has led many scholars to conclude that the fulfillment of Ezekiel 38 is still in the future, that the scenario described presupposes a period of relative peace and stability for Israel before the attack, possibly resulting from a regional peace agreement. And in that context, the events of 2025, with the Iranian nuclear program partially dismantled, the military tensions paused by a ceasefire, could be interpreted not as the end of the conflict, but as part of a realignment moving toward the scenario the text describes. And if what the prophets described is not a metaphor, but an advance report of events that are, right now, taking shape on the map, what does that mean for the order of what is yet to come? The prophecy of Ezekiel 38 does not end with the attack. It ends with the response, and the response described in the text is of a scale that has no parallel in any military operation in human history. Verse 18 of chapter 38 records, "On the day when Gog comes against the land of Israel, declares the Lord God, my wrath will be roused in my anger." And then comes the list. A great earthquake in the land of Israel, of such magnitude that the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the animals of the field, and every creature that crawls on the earth tremble at the manifestation. The mountains will be thrown down, the cliffs will crumble, every wall will fall to the ground. Verse 22 of chapter 38 completes the picture with the specificity that characterizes this entire section of the text. With pestilence and bloodshed, I will enter into judgment with him, and I will rain upon him and his hordes, and the many peoples who are with him torrential rains and hailstones, fire and sulfur. Ezekiel 39 adds the dimensions of what happens after the confrontation, the aftermath that the text describes with details that confound by their degree of specificity. There will be so many dead that the people of Israel will spend 7 months burying them. The weapons and equipment of the enemy armies will serve as fuel for 7 years. An entire valley will receive the name Valley of Hamon Gog, the Valley of the Multitude of Gog, as a permanent memorial to what happened there. And the surrounding nations will recognize in the scale of the destruction something that transcends the category of conventional war, something that no state's forces could have produced alone. Observe the geometry of what is developing. Israel back in its land after nearly 2,000 years of dispersion, a verifiable fulfillment of dozens of prophecies written by the Hebrew prophets themselves between the 8th and 5th centuries before Christ. Iran publicly assuming the destruction of Israel as a state objective, language that no modern diplomat can ignore, and which aligns perfectly with the role described by Ezekiel for Persia. Russia and Iran building a growing military alliance, documented by Western governments and confirmed by physical evidence on the Ukrainian battlefield, Turkey shifting increasingly toward anti-Israeli positions. At the center of all this, an Iran whose nuclear capability is being progressively degraded, but with an ideology that survives the destroyed centrifuges and the eliminated scientists. The name change of 1935 is a detail that biblical scholars frequently point to as illuminating, not because the name change alters the geographic or ethnic reality, but because it helps to understand why the prophecy of Ezekiel remained relatively obscure for so long in popular consciousness. For centuries, when Western readers encountered the name Persia in Ezekiel 38, the country that came to mind was the Achaemenid Empire of Cyrus and Xerxes, an extinct historical power gone for 2,000 years. Only from 1935 onward, with the official name change, did it become explicitly clear that the nation called Persia in the biblical texts and the nation called Iran in the modern world are the same country, the same people, the same territory, the same destiny recorded in the same pages. Iran today has a population of approximately 88 million people. A significant portion of this population, especially the generation under 30, which constitutes the demographic majority of the country, is deeply dissatisfied with the Ayatollah regime. Internal surveys and reports from human rights monitoring organizations repeatedly document the desire for change within Iranian society. The protests of 2022 that erupted following the death of Mahsa Amini mobilized hundreds of cities across the country, and the repression that followed revealed to the world the extent of the social dissatisfaction the regime faces internally. The Iranian people and the Iranian regime are not the same thing, and the biblical texts that pronounce judgment on the kings and princes of Elam make a distinction that analysts often forget. The judgment is on the structures of power, not on every person born in that territory. The restoration promised in Jeremiah 49 verse 39, "I will bring back the captives of Elam," remains as an open clause in the text. It has not been historically fulfilled in a verifiable way to this day. Elam, as an independent cultural and political entity, disappeared more than 2,500 years ago, absorbed by the Persian Empire of Cyrus. But the promise remains in the text, and the patterns of restoration that the prophets describe, judgment followed by renewal, collapse followed by reconstruction, are consistent throughout the entire biblical prophetic corpus. What the texts describe for Iranian territory is not a definitive end without any prospect of a future. It is a cycle that includes the most difficult passage before reaching the other side. What makes the prophecies about Iran different from any geopolitical analysis is this: they were not written after the facts, they were written before. Jeremiah wrote about Elam when Iran was not even called Persia yet. Ezekiel named Persia in the list of nations that would advance on Israel in a conflict of unprecedented scale. Daniel drew the historical arc of empires that had not yet been born. This is the most disconcerting datum in this entire story. It is not the prophecy that needs to adjust to reality. It is reality that slowly is adjusting to the prophecy. The bow of Elam was partially broken in June of 2025. The Natanz installations were struck. The nuclear scientists were eliminated, but Iran remains. The axis of resistance remains. The ideology that has defined the Iranian regime since 1979 remains. The text of Ezekiel 38 speaks of a coalition that still marches, not of a fragment of an already defeated coalition, but of the complete whole, assembled and moved toward a destiny that the same text describes with details that no human strategist could have documented 2,500 years before the countries involved existed in their current forms. There is a layer of the prophetic text about Iran that rarely appears in popular discussions of biblical eschatology, but which any rigorous reading of Isaiah cannot ignore. Isaiah chapter 21 verse 2 records an expression that interpreters have returned to for centuries: "Go up, O Elam, besiege, O Media." The context of Isaiah chapter 21 is the fall of Babylon, an event that was historically fulfilled when Cyrus the Great entered the city in 539 before Christ. And at the moment of Babylon's fall, who was on the side of the conquerors? Elam and Media, the peoples who composed the Medo-Persian Empire. The same people that Jeremiah had condemned decades earlier were participating in the overthrow of the greatest empire of their era. The prophetic irony is dense. The nation that would be broken served as an instrument of judgment upon an even greater nation. And after serving as an instrument, its own turn came. This pattern, nations being used as instruments of purposes greater than their own, and then facing the consequences of their own choices, is one of the most recurring themes of the entire biblical prophetic corpus. Assyria was used against Israel and then destroyed. Babylon was used against Judah and then brought down. Persia was used to restore Israel from exile and then went through its own process of judgment that Ezekiel described. Biblical history is not a meaningless cycle. It is a progression toward a final point. And modern Iran occupies, in the prophetic texts, the position of a nation that has not yet completed its arc. The text of Jeremiah speaks of a future restoration for the people of Elam, not for the regime that governs in the name of that people, but for the people themselves. For the sons and daughters born in that territory, who, as all the biblical texts insist, are not beyond the reach of either the judgment or the mercy that coexist on the same pages. That restoration clause, "I will bring back the captives of Elam in the latter days," has not yet found its verifiable fulfillment in recorded history. Elam, as an independent cultural entity, disappeared more than 2,500 years ago. But the promise remains open in the text, and promises that remain open in biblical prophetic texts have a documented track record of fulfillment. Not necessarily on the timeline readers anticipate, but on the timeline the text points to. Consider what happened with the text of Ezekiel about the restoration of Israel. For nearly 2,000 years after the Jewish state ceased to exist as a political entity, from 70 after Christ to 1948, the promise of restoration remained open. No political analyst of the 19th century would have bet that the state of Israel would exist again. History seemed to have definitively and irreversibly closed that question. And then, on the 14th of May of 1948, the impossible became fact. The same mechanic applies to the promise about Elam, not because the reader can determine the timeline, but because the pattern is too consistent to be ignored. The pieces are moving. They are moving in real time. In headlines you read on your phone screen, in briefings that presidents receive in the early hours of the morning, in speeches that leaders give at multilateral forums trying to contain what seems increasingly uncontainable. They are moving in the underground laboratories of Isfahan, in the Russian military bases, receiving Iranian drones, in summit meetings, where powers from the north and the south discuss the reordering of the Middle East. And behind every headline, beneath every risk analysis published in research centers in Brussels, Washington, and Tel Aviv, there is a text that was written when none of this yet existed. A text that named the countries, described the alignments, and projected the outcome centuries before any satellite, any intelligence service, or any predictive model came into operation. Jeremiah did not need a satellite. Ezekiel did not need a political analyst. Daniel did not need an artificial intelligence model. They wrote what they received, and what they received is, line by line, verse by verse, becoming increasingly difficult to ignore for anyone who places a map of the current world alongside a text 2,500 years old and begins to compare the names with attention. What makes the prophecies about Iran different from any geopolitical analysis is this: they were not written after the facts, they were written before. Jeremiah wrote about Elam when Iran was not even called Persia yet. Ezekiel named Persia in the list of nations that would advance on Israel in a conflict of unprecedented scale. Daniel drew the historical arc of empires that had not yet been born. This is the most disconcerting datum in this entire story. It is not the prophecy that needs to adjust to reality, it is reality that slowly is adjusting to the prophecy.